Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where I am very, very excited to have G. Cooper back on with us to discuss the Titian List. We have brought Titian sort of from his beginnings, working with Giorgione, working under the Bellini, and then we did this sort of crazy attempt at his life in 3 paintings, where we looked at his Assumption at the Frari, we looked at his portrait of Philip II, which is going to be very important for us today, and then we looked at his Flaying of Marsyas, that gruesome, brutal, and somewhat lovely painting that I'm obsessed with, to really show his painterly style. I brought G on today because we're talking about the Titian List, which is really a concept of an afterlife of a painter, but really how his presence in the courts during his life changed the projection of courtly painting in Europe. So Titian is still our most central figure, but we're going to be looking at courts beyond his lifetime. And G is somewhat of an expert in this case, right? But you've had some changes since the last time we talked. You're still working for the National Trust, but what are you doing now and what's changed?
Yeah, so hello everyone. So yeah, I'm still working for the National Trust, but I have moved properties. I'm now based at a house called Montpesson in Salisbury, which is quite unique for being a townhouse rather than a country house, but still very much, in the realm of heritage, which I'm still involved with.
So I just want to set the stage for us really quickly. So you've worked with courtly collections in the 17th century as part of your master's research. Do you want to explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So for my my master's, it specialized in the sort of the concept of the English country house, mainly in the 18th century. But to begin with, we delved with quite an extensive amount of research into the sort of origins of the English country house, which does start in sort of the late 16th century and really solidifies by the 17th century. And one of the aspects of my research was not just the sort of the country house as a building, but also it as a sort of a container and receptacle of things, objects of art in their own right. And these country houses have often immense art collections that have been built over generations. And one of the things that we delved into at the beginning of the research was sort of how do these art collections manifest? How did they come into being, particularly in England when before the 17th century, art collecting was really not sort of a fashionable thing to do, and it's sort of in the reign of Charles I, sort of in the first half of the 17th century, that it really sort of takes off as a fashion that would continue well beyond the 17th century.
Awesome. I just want to say our previous conversation was in this vein, but it was the actual architecture. How does Palladio, the Venetian Renaissance architect who sort of revives the temple front concept, and how does that get integrated into English architecture? I want to say as of today, sometime in July of 2023, I checked on our interview stats, and we've had, and this doesn't sound like a lot in as far as numbers are concerned, but for a podcast about something so very specific, 2,500 people have listened to it, which is
that is fantastic.
Yes, it is. It is. But names like Palladio and English Country House are not big draws for people. Typically,
it's very niche.
Yeah, Titian is another story.
Titian is very niche.
Yeah. So let's contextualize where we were, and where we're going, because there's a couple of Charleses, and we don't want to confuse our Charleses.
Lots of Charleses, lots of Philips.
Right. And we don't want to, I crossed my wires trying to prepare for this. Philip II, we talked about his portrait, not the portrait that I'm showing on the screen here, but we talked about his portrait, by one of his many portraits by Titian, but he also commissioned a set of completed seven works of mythology based off of Ovid from Titian during his reign, during Titian's lifetime. So they knew each other. Titian worked for him. He did this through the next image. You see the equestrian painting of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So the Charles I that is central to the concept of the Titian list is not Charles V, and he is somewhat, what would you say, 50 years after?
Yes, I would say sort of 50, 75 years sort of after.
Right. We've really transitioned into the Baroque period in Italy. I don't know what that means, that period in England, but the Baroque period in Italy. So Charles I is not Charles V, but you'll see there's this pictorial connection that we're going to talk about. Okay. So more or less, Charles I goes to Philip IV's court in Spain.
Philip IV's, yes.
Right. Who would be, of course, two generations, or not whole generations, but two reigns after Philip II. So when we say that Charles I saw Philip II's collection, Philip II's dead, right? But that is the work that he commissioned from Titian. And this is going to change collection practices across Europe, frankly. So let me hand the floor to G to catch us up on Charles I and what's going on here.
Absolutely. So as you can see, Charles I's reign begins in 1625 and ends quite abruptly in 1649 when he is beheaded. That's one of his big claim to fames. The big tumultuous event of Charles I's reign is what we call the English Civil War. Well, over in England, we just call it the Civil War, but obviously that would get quite confusing for international audiences. So Charles I was quite a controversial figure at the time, but really the story begins in terms of his love of art just before his reign. Actually, his first foray into art collecting is actually upon the death of his older brother, Prince Henry, who was supposed to inherit the throne. Charles inherits his elder brother's art collection and love of art collecting, and it's in 1623 that he embarks on a journey to Spain with the hopes of marrying the Spanish Infanta, the daughter of Philip IV of Spain. And it's here that he's really absolutely enamored by this amazing art collection that has been built up by the Spanish Habsburgs at this point. He's really gets to see the impact that an art collection can have on the prestige of a monarchy. And that is something that he really appeals to him, sort of the idea of that self-aggrandizement and trying to improve his image via this immense collection of art. And of course, central amongst all of this art is several works by Titian, and it's been cited in multiple sources that one of the artists that was really highly esteemed by Charles I was Titian. Sadly, this visit really doesn't come to anything. In fact, it leads to almost war between England and Spain, because this this alliance does not come to fruition. But what does happen is this introduction to art. In fact, as part of the marriage negotiations, Philip IV does at first offer several Titians to Charles I, including a portrait of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the Venus del Prado, the Rape of Europa, several paintings by Titian. Only the Venus del Prado and the portrait of Charles V actually leave Spain with Charles I, because it's a complete disaster, really, absolutely disaster, and it never really takes off. But we do end up with this amazing legacy of art collecting for Britain.
I sort of wonder, especially thinking, when I think back to sort of the earlier conversations about how cultures build themselves and how styles are either accepted or rejected. And when you have political adversary, you typically do not likewise inherit an artistic taste from that adversary, right? I think of sort of, not maybe in terms of conflict, but Italy during the Gothic period at the height of the Middle Ages starts to adopt this Northern architectural idiom, but ultimately decides it's sort of foreign and doesn't accommodate their needs. And this is where the Renaissance is kicking off, and Roman revival kind of usurps Gothic because it's this other Northern, beyond the Alps sort of art style. To come from England to Spain, to not find this sort of allegiance that you're looking for, but to still adopt or crave or seek to inherit a collection. Similarly, I think that speaks to the art itself, a testament to the impact, like the visual impact of the painting collection that kind of goes beyond the concept of the political alliance. Does that make any sense to you? Does that?
Absolutely. And I think it's so interesting because, in collecting in Britain at that time, before Charles I, it's very, very concentrated. There are only a select few people like, Charles I's elder brother, or Charles I's mentor, confidant, the very close friend of Charles I's father, James I, who was the Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, had an immense collection of Italian art, including Titian's, and Lord Arundel, who was one of possibly the great early collectors of Britain at this time. And so, but he, interestingly enough, tended to focus more on collecting sort of Northern art, Flemish, Dutch pieces. So it's interesting to see that there is that collection of sort of more localized art, but then you do start to see this desire for something that is sort of more intellectual, more, they see it as something that is further removed from what they currently already have. Mm-hmm. And so that is seen as a mark of aristocracy. It's all about proving your superiority over the masses. And one of those elements is this amount of education that you possess and this intellectual superiority. And at this time, really, because of the impact of the Renaissance, Italy is seen as this sort of hub, as this heart of this intellectual superiority and this superiority of taste almost. And I think even though you have rivals with Spain and England, almost the rivalry, and this does happen later on, comes also from this desire to compete and collect these works of art. And, they compete and try to outdo each other with what they can collect and what they can amass in terms of art and artists.
So I'm not sure actually about Philip II's court, but the way I understand with Charles I is that his very impressive Titian collection, we're about to get to that here in a second, and I'm going to transition us here too, is actually private. It's not on full public display. It's in his sort of I forget the name of the room, several rooms, but personal. It's meant for showing off, but it's not meant for general public consumption.
It is. It's interesting how royal palaces, particularly Whitehall, operates at that time. So Whitehall is the name of the main royal palace in London. Its biggest claim to fame nowadays, sadly, it's burnt down. But the one thing that survives is the amazing banqueting hall that was built by Inigo Jones, with fabulous Rubens ceiling.
We talked about Inigo Jones in the last one.
Yes, so this is very much the Charles I. This is the era of Inigo Jones, of Rubens, and of course we'll talk about later on Sir Antony Van Dyck. But yeah, so at Whitehall, it's a labyrinth of a palace, absolutely ridiculous. It was bigger than Versailles, bigger than any other royal palace at the time, but it was just a rabbit warren of rooms, some more public, some more private. And this Titian List, this list created by Van der Dort, showcases the various rooms and the various levels of public accessibility to this collection. And you do see that the more private you get, sort of the more exclusive you go into these royal apartments called the privy lodgings, the more exclusive and more important the art gets. And so by the time you get to sort of the privy chambers, you do see quite a collection of Titians that Charles has amassed over his reign.
So let's backtrack a little bit, because what I wanted us what we will look at here is what Charles I saw when he was in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
This is an awesome little link that I'll try to put up for people, and it's talking about Titian's poesie paintings and what the poesie paintings are. We talked about poesie with Professor Schmitter on Giorgione's Tempest, and what we were discovering is it's really hard to present a solid definition of what a poesie painting is, or a poesia painting, because for Giorgione it was the painting itself expresses a sort of poetic sentiment, because with Tempest we couldn't really figure out what was going on. It was more about color and composition and the storm and the feeling, and some term that poesia painting, the feeling, a painting designed to give off a poetic feeling. But in this case, poesia paintings are something different. They are specifically after Ovid. In this case, Metamorphosis and other classic works, probably the Fasti. But as we see, 6 paintings were produced over 10 years, from 1551 to 1562 for Philip II, based on Ovid. That means paintings that are showing, and Ovid it's not prose, it's verse. So paintings that represent a certain amount of verse, right? We looked at the Metamorphosis excerpt for the Flaying of Marsyas. I read that to you in my best Ovidian attempt at making it sound good, but the paintings represent these verses, and therefore it's called a poesia series. So 6 were completed. There's a 7th that never made it to Spain, but the National Gallery here has been great to put the 6 here. And I'm just going to show them really quick before we land on Europa, because we want to talk about Europa, don't we?
Yes.
So he does Danae, really one of these paintings that people kind of tie back to Venus of Urbino, and Venus and Adonis, Diana and Actaeon. I think the 7th piece is actually the scene where Actaeon is what's he killed, turned into a deer, and is this the one turned into a deer and she sends the dogs after him or something?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. Diana and Callisto, which it doesn't show the full thing here, but marvelous. Perseus and Andromeda, another really marvelous piece. And then ultimately Rape of Europa. So, looking at Rape of Europa, this is the piece that is in the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum, the museum that had that very, very famous heist. And there's like a Netflix series on it. And I watched one episode, and, I didn't watch any more, but that's just in Boston. So that's about an hour and a half for me to go see this. So this made it to the United States, but I think all the others are between the Prado and...
We've got quite a few in Britain.
Yeah.
And this is the one that got away.
Yeah. These are the original paintings that were in Philip II's Titian room that Charles I saw, and they were meant to accompany each other. So what do we have here? And I want to just look at style because we talk about style so much, because Flaying of Marsyas is one of the last works he does, and it is extremely painterly, textured. This is somewhat before that, of some, I guess, 15 years or so, 10, 15 years or so before Marsyas, but we really see a full painterly approach, the sort of thing that the Impressionists later pick up on, right? We said Edouard Manet specifically studies Titian. But in any case, what's the story here for Metamorphosis? Jupiter has seen Europa and he's interested in her, so he transforms himself into a bull. Remember, Metamorphosis is about change. Most of these things are transformations. Port Marsyas was transformed from a faun or a satyr into flesh, just a skinless husk, which is awful. We see this all the time, like famously Apollo and Daphne. Daphne's turned into the laurel bush. All of these stories are about changes. So he transforms himself into a bull and seems docile and seems peaceful, and Europa gives him this wreath across his horns, and then he takes off, right? And it looks like he's kind of swimming in a wave off of the shoreline, and you can see these mountains in the background. Are Titian's just kind of brushstrokes. You can see them, and especially when you get up close and personal with his painting, very, very kind of rough paint strokes. And we've always talked about Florentine disegno, Venetian colorito. And when we were talking about Bellini, who of course Titian trained under, we were very specific that there's actually more of an interchange between Florence, between the Venetian school, that this really like structured divide between disegno and colorito is a little exaggerated. But by time we're in the middle of the 16th century, this is Venetian colorito. This is the emphasis on brushstroke, on color, disegno, outline, underdrawing, perspective. It's thrown to the wind, guys, right? Look at these figures. The perspective to me, and maybe you agree or not, G, is a little off. The proportions are off, but we're really moved by the brushstroke, looking like the texture of the bull. And you can even see, I told you guys, he uses an impasto, this thing that Van Gogh is famous for, this big glob, one stroke of white to make that eye glisten. But when you look at the painting in person, it's actually really thick paint, and you can see the paint. And Venetian, mother, Titian's not trying to hide the paint or create nature. He's trying to create a poetic effect based on a poem, right? Sorry, I'm rambling. Do you have something to say about this?
No, it's fantastic. I think I really enjoy the sort of the background. The blue is just so vivid. I think that's the one thing that I'm just really drawn to. And I think I said to you earlier, I think this is what really appeals to, I think, the contemporary audience at the time, or sort of post-contemporary audience in the sort of early 1600s, is this fascination with just the ability to create movement in a still piece of art. Because I think, you talked about sort of the more solid forms, say, of Bronzino, etc. But you see the same thing in the sort of the history legacy of portraiture and art in Britain prior to the 1600s, which, I mean, pretty much art is just portraiture by that point. It's very static, it's very flat, and you start to see these influences really creep in. The depth of the fabric and the fact that you can just see it moving and catching the light. I think it's something that really captivated our audiences at the time, and I think you can really see why Titian was so highly revered as an artist by these collectors, and why he was so emulated by artists, long after his death.
Yeah, and we're going to jump back away from this. I just wanted to kind of give everyone a taste of this, but just for people who are new to talking about art in their titles, especially when you're looking at things like Ovid, it's called the Rape of Europa, and he is taking her, and that is really what it means. And there might be some kind of non-consensual consummation happening, but rape, the word rape itself does not mean that in this case, right? If we see sculptures like the Rape of Persephone, it's Hades taking Persephone forcefully into the underworld. It's the stealing of someone, right? Now, there is implications about sexual acts that come with that, but the word rape in this case does not, and I'm sorry I'm saying it so much, but it doesn't mean that explicitly. So the topic of the actual episode, we've set it up. We know what's going on here, and we're probably near the end anyway. But this is the birth of the Titian List. Charles I sees so many works by Titian in Philip II's collection. Well, Philip IV's collection that was made by Philip II, and makes one of his own. So where does this list come from, G, and why is it so important?
So this is a list that's created, I believe, in 1639 by a gentleman called Abraham van der Dort, who is quite a significant figure because he's actually the first of what we call the surveyor of the king's pictures, which, interestingly enough, is a role that still exists. Of course, recently we've had the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, but throughout history, the surveyor of the King's pictures was responsible for, well, the title says it all, the surveying of these pictures, but really the curating of what became known as the Royal Collection, which is the collection of art amassed by many, many generations of sovereigns of England, Britain, the United Kingdom. And really, this collection, the nucleus of this collection, is really created by Charles I. He is the first sovereign of sort of the early modern era to really take an interest in art that isn't just portraits of himself and his family and the monarchs that came before him, because before that, that's really all that there was to see in royal palaces. And so this list is really a sort of a compilation of his personal interest in art and sort of a collection of really his ambition, his intellect, and his passion for art that sort of transcends what was already commonly available in England at that time, which was not a lot, to be very honest.
And just to give people a little bit of insight as to how this process works, like historically, I don't think as of now there remains just a book that was Abraham van der Dort's list of paintings in the collection. They're manuscripts broken up. Some have been rewritten, copied from originals. The originals are gone and they're spread out, right? I don't think scholars, unless they are interested in the actual manuscript culture, would actually read this image that you see. There are brilliant transcriptions that I tried to read, and I realized they're in Dutch. So he's not even writing them in English for Charles I. Who did he know Dutch? Do we know? I know I didn't.
I don't. That's a very good question, actually. I don't know. I mean, certainly he had a huge interest in Flemish and Dutch art, but it is interesting that it is composed in Dutch.
Yeah. But these transcriptions are available. I tried to read them. I don't know Dutch, and I think it's kind of like Dutch Latin. There's some Latin in there, I think, but I'm not. Send me to the Mediterranean. That's where my bubble is. But, so yeah, I mean, basically just recording. And there was a second list that if people decide to jump down the rabbit hole, what was it? It's at his execution.
Yes. So this list was produced in 1639, which was just on the eve of what would later come to be the English Civil War. It mainly kicks off in 1641, but there are echoes of it around this time. And then another list is produced after 1649, about a decade later, which is after the execution of Charles I. And this list is really created because, I mean, one of the reasons Charles I was so unpopular was because of his extravagance. He took the country quite deeply into debt, and he had quite a lot of debts. And after he was executed and overthrown by the Commonwealth government, those debts still needed to be paid. And so one of the ways that Cromwell and his new government decided to go about settling these debts was to amass a huge list of all of these works of art and to sell them. And there was some success. It wasn't really that successful. A lot of these paintings were actually undersold for their value. A portrait by Van Dyck went for about £4. You could, I think, a Titian went for about £100, and that was considered one of the higher end ones, which is quite extensive when you think about the amount of money that Charles actually spent amassing this collection. But one of the interesting things that happens is, because of the failure of this sale to garner sufficient revenue, rather than sell the paintings and then pay off the debts with the cash from the paintings, they just started to give away the paintings as a way of paying off the debt itself. So there's a recent article that went up about a Titian that was recently came up for auction, that had been given to, I think it was Charles I's plumber, who was owed a debt of about £900, but rather than being given, he was given £300 in cash and then a collection of art, including this Titian, to pay off the debt. So it's interesting to see how this collection ended up being dispersed.
And we can bookmark that, because I actually have a little bit on the article at the end of the presentation.
I'm sorry, I think I've jumped ahead with that one.
That's okay. So you mentioned Van Dyck, and I think that's important, because part of what the Titian list does, it helps us contextualize what our point is in the beginning, how Titian's work is changing art in the courts in this period. Mm-hmm. And Van Dyck, for different reasons, for Charles I's own taste, but also his own artistic curiosity, is going to be looking after Titian for a lot of works that he does during his what do we call it? His employment under Charles I, mm-hmm. right? And what we're talking about is essentially looking at Titian. We're looking at Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and similar equestrian portraits of Charles I by Van Dyck, who's looking at Titian. I know we kind of briefed on bringing this comparison up, and I really hope, as a non-Van Dyck expert by any stretch of the imagination, that this is the portrait you were talking about.
Absolutely, okay. Absolutely. And I think you can easily, I mean, just straight away, just the pose is pretty much identical. They're mirror images of each other. They're both on horseback. They're both sort of in the midst of riding, resplendent in armor. And I think that is the most obvious sort of similarity between them. But I think also, if you think back to when we were looking at the Rape of Europa and that color palette and that way of painting, I think, and I pointed out the blue sky, funnily enough, right. You see that, I think, in this portrait of Charles I by Van Dyck. I think you really see how Van Dyck was, inspired by Titian, as well as Charles I also being inspired by Titian. I think it was quite a perfect match for Van Dyck to come under the employment of Charles I in a similar way to Titian being at the court of Charles V about 100 years earlier.
Do we think that, the court painter isn't new at this time? We know Francois I employs Leonardo da Vinci as a court painter. We talked about Mehmed the Conqueror, once Gentile Bellini, or any Italian, really, he would take anybody. They sent Gentile Bellini, wanted an Italian court painter, right? There's this kind of, the Ottomans want Italian court painters, the French want Italian court painters. So is Van Dyck seeing himself in light of an Italian tradition? This is a complicated question. I don't think I prepped you for. In light of an Italian tradition, or is there something else going on in the North that he's a part of? Is this happening in England before this moment, is my question.
Well, I think it's interesting that before, like I say, the idea of a court painter, as you say, is not new. It's not new in England either. I mean, you think back to Henry VIII, and his court was heavily painted by Hans Holbein. Wow. And even before Van Dyck arrived on the scene, Daniel Muytens was effectively the court painter at the court of James I, Charles I. You also had Cornelius Jansen or Johnson, who was another prolific portrait painter. These were deeply popular at the time. You had Robert Peake and William Larkin also painting. I think the amazing difference is just what Van Dyck brought to the table. Mm-hmm. And I think that was something quite unlike. If you look at any of these previous court portraits, even ones of Charles I by Muytens, they're very flat. The backgrounds have no interest. Generally, there's sort of a weirdly perspective Turkish carpet on the ground. There might be some sort of prop or table or something. The perspective is not always the best. The idea is just to almost not to depict the figure as they are, but more because really at this time, the general public had no idea what their sovereign looked like apart from images on mostly coins, to be honest. But what's interesting is Van Dyck introduces, as I talked about earlier, this idea of movement, of this interest to these paintings. And it's actually a portrait by Van Dyck of Nicolas Lanier, who was one of the, I believe, what's the word?
I don't know.
I know, I'm trying to think. Sort of intermediaries of art collecting for Charles I and other courts and, other nations in Europe at the time. And Lanier is actually painted by Van Dyck, and it entered the royal collection. Charles I had it, and he was absolutely enamored by this portrait that looked so unlike anything that had been painted before. And probably to him, he thought to himself, I could have my own Titian at court.
Yeah.
And I think that was really his goal, was to have a court painter like Titian, so associated with the court and prestige of Charles V, Philip II, to have something of his own. He's seen what is possible with an art collection. His next thing on the list is to have his own painter. And it's actually interesting that even though Van Dyck starts off his career and he paints his own poesie, but actually once he's under the employment of Charles I, it's strictly portraiture. And you see them, they're prolific. It's not just Charles I. I mean, there's a running joke that most country houses in England have a portrait of Charles I by Van Dyck. No. That's how prolific they are. But he's also painting, his wife, his children, his friends. There was a certain prestige associated with having a portrait by Van Dyck after this point, which I think is a testament to this impact.
And I think what's really important, we're going to transition away from the set of portraits in a second here, is that it's not just copying Titian, right? You have a sort of a smoother brushstroke, more in line with the Dutch tradition. But you're still, the composition is Titian, but you still get these painterly aspects kind of fusing with a smoother finish, right? Because I think Van Dyck's equestrian portrait here looks a lot, and it's not just the grain of the photo. It's a reduced version of this really heavy brushstroke that Titian uses. So it's not just copying, because we're seeing this a lot with pose. And we see this with the poses for, what is it, the 11 Caesars, right? And that's our next transition here, where Titian did these portraits of, and you know what, you know the history of how he's gotten his collection, and I'll let you take that on. But what I will say is, as far as this image is concerned, we're talking about this royal collections recorder. There is also the royal engraver, Robert Van Voorst. I don't know, Robert Van Voorst, who does these engravings after Titian's portraits, and that's how we have at least the Otho, which is relevant to this portrait by Van Dyck of Charles I. That is in a private collection, was on loan to the Phoenix Museum, so I only found a black and white photo of it. But can you talk about this relationship and how Charles I got these Roman portraits and how he's employing them in his own image?
Absolutely. So, as I said, when Charles I goes to Spain, that's in 1623. He's not yet king. And in fact, that was, once he became king, his ability to go abroad was reduced to nothing, which meant that going abroad to collect art became impossible for him. And so he did have to rely on other connections, intermediaries, people who would report back to him. And something amazing happened, well, for Charles I anyway. The Gonzaga dynasty, the Dukes of Mantua in Italy, so a series of quite short in succession deaths of the Dukes of Mantua led to the, at the time, present Duke, who happened to be in a significant amount of debt and was, despite his brother and father and grandfather being avid art collectors, he himself was not. And so he just saw this burden of an art collection that he had, whereas he had no money, and war was a constant thing in Italy at this time. So you have this collection that comes on sale, lock, stock and barrel, the whole thing, this amazing collection of Titian, Mantegna, Da Vinci. There's all sorts of, Charles I would have seen this list and would have thought, this checks all the boxes. This is what I want. This is what I need. And so he buys the whole thing, lock, stock and barrel. He actually buys all of the collection apart from, funny enough, these set 11 Caesars by Titian and the Triumphs of Caesar by Mantegna. Those were sort of held in reserve because they were seen as the jewels of the collection. And it took a bit more persuading to actually get those to part ways, but he did get the whole thing.
Wow.
And so this was really the jewel in the collection. And actually, it caused even further of a rift between England and Spain because Philip IV also really wanted this collection and didn't get his hands on it. So, as I mentioned before about this sort of competing for art collections, this was one of the main ones I was referring to. This, the Gonzaga collection was one of the greatest, well, would be one of the greatest sales of art until the sale of Charles's own collection a few decades later, ironically enough.
Oh, wow, that's really fascinating. And it this kind of word when we were talking about doing this together that we made up, this Titianomania, right?
Yes.
We talk about Caravaggio mania after he died, and everyone's copying him and trying to get his works, and the whole basically Baroque style in Italy changes after that, and continues to the present day. The same sort of situation is happening with Titian. It's his name is a must-have, especially for Charles I. And, I meant to prep for this, and I'm so foolish to have not done so. I sort of wonder why he's chosen the pose of Otho, who frankly is an emperor I had never heard of until doing this. Because, are we likening ourselves to Roman emperors as, is he doing an equestrian, you're always thinking of yourself as a Roman emperor. You have the Holy Roman Empire. But when you have a portrait like this, which is kind of like made up by Titian, the pose is made up, but it becomes representative of a Roman imperial identity. And I'm wondering if Otho had anything to do with Roman conquest in England, because we know Hadrian brings it all the way up to of course, Hadrian's Wall. And I don't know if you know anything about that. If not, we can just get away from that. But
that's very interesting to think about. I don't actually think, certainly I think Otho was emperor during sort of the occupation of Britain, but I don't think, I can't sort of think off the top of my head of any sort of real stark connection.
There might be. I just thought maybe it'd be fun to explore, but really kind of off topic here. Well, in a way, like if you're viewing yourself in light of Italian Renaissance painters, but also in light of imperial portraits, like what is the connection between? It's like in the Quattrocento, looking at Byzantium is also looking at, like, in Florence, you're thinking of Byzantium, but it's also ancient Rome, right? It's the Roman Empire, but they're also Greek. And it's trying to reconcile these cultural differences based on like a loose understanding and based on mythology around these places and empires and who they are and how you paint your own identity in light of them. So I'm kind of curious, is Renaissance Italy, Titian's Renaissance Italy, the same kind of locality as the Roman Empire, or is the Roman Empire England for Charles I? That's kind of what I'm thinking about. I don't know.
It is interesting to think about, and I certainly know that Charles I had something of a complex. He was not the tallest of gentlemen. Again, another reason why his, the most successful portraits of him are on horseback, which is to disguise the fact that he was not very tall. He also was forever, I mentioned before, his elder brother, Prince Henry, who died quite young. He was set up as the model prince. He was going to be, the next great sort of king of England, and it never happened. And Charles I stepped in, and I think he always had this sort of inferiority complex of, and I think this heavily links into what I was saying earlier, how when he goes to Spain and he sees what art can do for your personal prestige. And so what we really see as a big part of Charles I's reign is image making. And there's a reason why when you think of Charles I, you think of Charles I by Van Dyck, the Van Dyck mustache, you think of that image. It's completely on purpose. It's the whole creation that Charles has really man-made. It's a lot of artifice and it's intentional.
Fantastic. Let's see. So just to wrap up here, what has been a really awesome conversation is this was from, I think, The Guardian, and this was from 2018. But I just want to kind of show that this is still part of the art world, part of the collecting world, this topic that we're talking about. So Titian painting given to Charles I plumber goes up for sale. You had referenced that this plumber was paid in paintings in part.
Yes.
And that this magnificent, painting of Saint Margaret, kind of escaping the devil or whatever, in this very, very kind of traditional, what we're talking about, painterly Titian style. Look at the background. Look how, it's just fantastic. The details are all given to St. Margaret. Everything else is just this loose kind of, what do we say, flippant brush strokes. This was just put up for sale. So we're still seeing Charles I's collection move around on the market after his execution, which I think is just, in 1649. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
So we're 500 years later, so just under that, seeing the effects of this transition, the effects of Philip II employing Titian in the 1500s, doing this poesie series, which is just so beautiful. And Charles I going to the court to see these paintings in Spain. Well, do you know where that was? Was that Madrid? Where was
that? Was in Madrid, yes.
Madrid. Going to Madrid, seeing this collection, and just the ripple effect to Van Dyck, and how this changes our perception of courtly painting, of afterlives, of Renaissance painting, but really that Titian becomes a central figure in a larger collection, kind of collecting culture, that artists are emulating him as court painter, not really as Venetian Renaissance master, even though he is, but as court painter to either Charles V or Philip II, or the Dukes of Mantova, because he does this series for them. And we even talked about his series for Alfonso d'Este. So he's really court painter at the highest level, and that is an afterlife. It continues beyond Titian. In any case, any last comments, final words, anything to say, G, before we depart?
No, I mean, I have such a huge love for art, and I think when I knew you were doing about Titian, and my knowledge of Titian was purely through this sort of lens of how much interest there was in him after his death, I thought it was, such an interesting collaboration to do. And I think I've certainly learned a lot from this. And no, it's been great. Thank you for having me.
Of course, me too. And just to pull the curtain back a little bit, G and I message each other ad nauseum about these art topics, and it just so happens that my expertise really stops right where hers picks up. So
yes, I was saying, I keep saying, for all the sort of respective knowledge that we have, there is very little crossover, which is very entertaining.
Right.
So
I came in this, knowing, a fair amount about Titian's career. Up till, I kind of stopped in the end. Reading about Flaying of Marsyas was something that I was lucky to do for this. So getting into the 1570s is a little late for me. And then she's talking to me about Charles I. I said, Charles who? I don't know what we're talking about here. And after, 2 weeks of throwing articles at each other, we were able to finally, hunker down our knowledge and come to a mutual conversation that we could both have, which I think was really, really fun and exciting. So thank you so much for coming on the show again.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, Renaissance people, I'm going to conclude here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will be back again, but we're departing from Titian on the next episode. Of course, as usual, follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, check out the Etsy store, which is growing, and I think it's coming along really cool. Consider becoming a patron, because a lot of the articles and scholarship that we talked about, I'm going to have on the Patreon, in addition to, I think I might do an exclusive episode on one more piece by Titian. Until then, folks, arrivederci.